So for the defining and implementing effective programs and curricula, a unit plan needed to be created with lessons that are aligned to the students in your classroom, and also providing a summary of the classroom. So I created this lesson plan for this micro-credential, which looked at a ninth grade English class. And it's a unit plan for a small group self-contained English grade 9 classroom in a high school. So that's why I chose this classroom to use to look at creating a lesson plan for the students, just because between the IEPs and the multilingual learners in the room, there was a lot of scaffolding and accommodations that needed to be made. So I thought it would be the best way to really hone in on the different types of interventions that I could provide for multilingual learners. So my rationale for this unit was that based on the STAR iReady and Access data that I looked at for the students, it was obvious that they were not going to be successful if I just threw the regular curriculum at them. So I took one of the units that we had to do, which was the short story unit that the students needed to look at, and I determined how I could take that lesson and have it not only meet the Common Core standards, but also the WIDA standards. And I created some objectives for my students so that they will orally and through written responses explain key literary elements in the story using sentence starters, vocabulary binders, graphic organizers, class notes, teacher modeling, and peer discussion. They'll orally and through written responses explain the main theme and the plot of the story using their notes, class activities, peer discussions, videos shown in class, and teacher modeling. And the students will write in their vocab binder any new words that come up that they don't understand using teacher supports and Google in the dictionary. So the overview for this unit is it is a short story unit that my ninth grade curriculum did require of my students. The curriculum follows a set plan for ninth graders that all ninth grader teachers use, and it's off of Study Sync from McGraw-Hill. There were 2 short stories that the other classes were using, which is The Necklace and Harrison Bergeron. And then I also found a really great little memoir that I wanted the students to read called Names Nombres by Julia Alvarez. I absolutely loved it when I read it on my own, so I wanted to incorporate that into this unit as well. So I did do 3 short stories with the students instead of the 2. So for this unit, I had some guiding questions that kind of helped me with my planning, and I kind of knew that I wanted at the end to be able to have hit on these main guiding questions. And I also had some big ideas for the units that I wanted my students to be able to hit, like having the opportunity to analyze character development, understand the impact of a setting and a plot on the theme, and looking at central messages or themes within a story. There were performance-based assessments at the end of the unit. They do have a choice board project sheet, which I will show later, where they got to choose how they were going to show that they fully understand the 3 stories that were read. We would, for the 3 stories, work together on reading the stories and discussing what was happening in them to kind of build that foundation. There was a lot of modeling thinking that goes on in this unit. But through this unit, students work on determining these literary devices and work on the skills of determining where in the story the devices come up. They had to define these terms in their vocab binder, which I use the vocab binder sheets that do the column with the word, the definition in their home language, the definition in English, and a picture that goes with it, and also using it in a sentence. My students do this with me all the time, and we keep the binders in the classroom. They're actually in 3-ring binders, and the students can flip through their binder as we continuously are learning, so they always have a reference sheet to go back to. And they're allowed to reference these binders whenever they need it. And the binders are kept in the classroom for the students to grab at any point that they should need it while they're doing the work. For the first lesson, which I did names and nombres, I looked at my classroom profile, which I already explained was a self-contained 9th grade classroom with my 11 students. And I also looked at different strategies. I picked 3 different strategies I wanted to try with this lesson to help my multilingual learners. So strategy 1 was recorded reading clips and annotated notes to help reiterate learning for Names Nombre, the short story. Strategy 1 took about 2 class periods to get that done. The second strategy was an activity opening and closing peer share for a think, pair, share in multiple languages for Names and Nombre in the short story. And that took about 2 days. And then the third strategy were those vocab binder sheets that I was talking about. And that is used throughout the unit. And they are allowed to reference those as much as possible. I do offer the students extra credit points whenever they use the words in conversation in the classroom, we're having discussions, or in their writing. We're not asked to use them. So they kind of like that added game with the vocab binder as well. So I broke this lesson down and I had some objectives for the lesson, how they relate to the standards. I had language-based expectations for my students. I like to highlight my language-based expectations so that I remember that the green is what they are doing, and the light blue is the why they're doing it, and then the purple is how they're going to access the information to do it. And I just like to color code that for my own self, just so I can visually see when I'm looking at the lesson plan what my expectations are for the students. And then I have my materials list in my unit plan. I also like to list out some key terms that I would like them to be able to know, and then I also allow them to add their own unfamiliar words into their vocab charts whenever they want to. I gave myself some essential learning questions that I want the students to be able to answer by the end of the reading. And then I also look at the language demands. What is this lesson demanding of the students? It's expecting them to be able to use their reading, oral, and written language skills to be able to define, synthesize, and discuss a short story. And it's important just to keep in mind those language demands as you're building your lesson plans and your unit plans so that you're keeping your expectations of the students in a realistic goal. It's great to set high standards, but if you set them too high that they always fail, it frustrates the students. So I find just reminding myself of the language demands that I'm putting on the students helps me kind of build the rest of my lesson. I always do a lesson breakdown, and I always do a rationale, and then I like to list the MLL strategies that I would be using within my lesson. So I do have the multiple columns. My rationale just helps me remember why I'm making them do each piece of this activity. And then I also have my my scaffolding, what I do for my non-multilingual learners and what I am scaffolding for my multilingual learners, and also the assessments and why I'm assessing them. I do like to keep my unit plans organized this way just because it works for me and it helps me just have a better understanding of where I'm heading with the unit. And I also like to have an expansion of the lesson. I like to give homework that isn't like pen and paper busy work, but is something that kind of engages the student with their families. So I usually like to have my students go home and read the story to their family member, maybe in their home language, translate it into their home language for them so they can go home, or just have a conversation with a family member about what they learned from the story. I just think it's kind of fun to like have them go home and be like, hey, you should tell your parents about this or your guardians about this. Just having those conversations, just because I feel like social language is just as important as academic language. So I did that for all my short stories. I had the 3 of them, and I have all that data here. But then I also have all the worksheets down at the bottom of this unit plan. But the one thing I did want to show is the end of unit project, which is a choice board for my students. This comes after they've read the 3rd short story, and they get to pick one of these options on how they want to showcase what they learned. So for the first choice, it's a song or a rap. They can write a song or a rap that explains the conflict in any of the 3 stories that we read that really stood out for them. They can do character Olympics, where they create an award ceremony for all the major characters in all 3 of the stories. And they would write about like what they would receive and why they would receive it, and then they pick which story they would like the best as a gold winner, a 2nd place, and then a 3rd place winner, and explain why they felt like these medals were deserved. Then there's a character swap activity where they get to swap 2 characters from 2 different stories that we read, and just write a little short story about the swap. Like, how would that character adapt to the new story that he's being thrown into? Do you think they'd want to return back to their own life? Why or why not? And they can do that also in choice D, but as a comic strip. So they can either write it in a short story or they can do it as a comic strip. Prediction predicament. They pick one of the characters in one of the stories that they read, and they can write or they can tell and record themselves telling a short story of their own that explores what happens to them after the end of the author's story. And their story can take place immediately after the events of the story, or they can jump in time. The student gets to pick. The audiobook, they could record themselves reading their favorite of the 3 stories out loud, and they have to read with an expressive and engaging voice. And then at the end, they would explain why the story was their favorite of the 3. They can practice it several times until they're comfortable, and share that out. And that's one of the options as well. And then there's the option of pretend you're interviewing one of the main characters of the story. They can do a little mock interview. They can create a picture book for one of the stories as well. Or they can just write the traditional 5-paragraph essay comparing literary elements that they have in common. And the choice board is kind of my final project end of the unit test grade. And I like giving my students expressive ways to share out what they know and also give them the choice and take ownership in their own education. It also alleviates some of the stress for the students by allowing them to pick how they share out what they know.